Hi everyone, welcome back to another week of Intercultural Competence and Communication. We're up to week 8 this week. This week is the last week of the main intercultural communication section of this unit. Started off with 2 introductory weeks looking at the key concepts that you've been using in your responses to the DMIS in Assessment Task 4. And we did 2 intermediary lectures on intercultural competence, and now we've done the 4 lectures on intercultural communication on the nuts and bolts. We'll continue on with if there are a few more theoretical things I want to touch on in the last 4 lectures, but we've done the lion's share of that in these 4 lectures. This is the last of those. So some of the questions that are going to guide us today are: what role should education play in the development of cultural competency and communication, democracy and social justice? How is intercultural communication influenced by the efforts we make to accommodate people from diverse backgrounds in conversation and interaction? To what extent is cultural identity a reflection of hegemonic concepts of national identity, and how should this inform efforts at promoting intercultural communication? And how is this issue reflected at a practical and ongoing areas of intercultural misunderstanding and miscommunication like gender? So to recap from last week, you'll recall that we looked at verbal communication as a feature of metacognition, as a primary defining framework of verbal communication. You'll recall we looked at high and low context communication, which encompassed everything from covert and overt messages, direct and indirect messages, self-enhancement versus self-effacement, to elaborate understated communication styles and the dynamics associated with individualism, collectivism. We capped that off by looking at social identity theory, looking at the way people drive a stem from a group in which they positively identify, providing motivation to favour the in-group, and looked at the in-group and out-group dynamics associated with social identity theory. If you're interested in that, I encourage you to chase up more. I can only sort of provide a general overview in the lectures. It's if you find something that interests you, by all means go and do further research, because you can dig up a lot more information without a great deal of difficulty. And look at the weekly readings, of course, too. And you recall that in week 6, before the break, we looked at combining assessment and learning styles, non-verbal communication, and language, culture, and identity as a feature of cultural studies. We're going to pick up on the cultural studies theme a bit again today. Our key concepts for today: critical pedagogy as an aspect of metacognition in intercultural communication. We'll look at communication accommodation theory. This is one of these. There are quite a number of intercultural communication theories floating around. This is one of them. We'll look at a few more in the coming weeks, as I say. And we're going to look at the gender identity and hegemony as theme in cultural studies as part of the broader orbit of intercultural communication, if you like. So let's start off with critical pedagogy. As noted, we looked at started off the unit by looking at the historical and sociological context for study of intercultural communication. I've looked at the DMIS to look at the range of abilities associated with intercultural sensitivity, and we've looked at cultural studies for broader perspectives in the humanities on the intercultural engagement. We looked at experiential learning, and at the end of this process, to sort of bring these all together, from the historical sort of theoretical to practicalities, we're going to look at the critical pedagogy, so the application of formal education tools to the development of intercultural communication competencies. There's a few links down the bottom. These are sort of readings. I encourage you to check those out properly. So what is critical pedagogy and where does it come from? Critical pedagogy, I would argue, is an educational response to neoliberal ideology, which is an extreme free market ideology that first emerged during the early 1980s. Neoliberalism blah, blah. Neoliberalism reflects a paradigm shift away from Keynesian demand-side economics to supply-side trickle-down economics, which we most commonly associated with the Reagan Revolution in the 80s in the US. Reagan was elected in 1980, of course, by beating Jimmy Carter, and we also associate with this with neoliberalism and supply-side economics with Thatcherism. It's all about the giving sort of expediting the flow of wealth upwards in the name of, the sort of the rising tide that lifts all boats. So we get the kind of dismantling and welfare and dismantling of regulations and all this kind of businesses, freeing up business from, constraints and all this kind of stuff. And this is supposed to flow on to everyone, but it doesn't usually. I mean, we've seen over the last 3.5 decades, or four almost, that all it really does is expedite the flow of wealth upwards. There's no real trickle down. But this the ideological paradigm that sort of accompanied this shift has sort of had market effects throughout the economy. Naomi Klein calls neoliberalism corporate supremacism. I think that's from the Shock Doctrine. If you haven't read the Shock Doctrine, I definitely encourage you to do. Naomi Klein's a pretty great author all around. So we find in the education sector, neoliberal political tendencies have imposed a definition of excellence in education, which is equated with submission to market pressures, which they put ahead of educational excellence through innovative intellectual production. So, they sort of, they kind of redefine education as, it's sort of defined, not in terms of good in and of itself for society, but, as a means to an end, as a meal ticket, which is a fairly, arguably a fairly kind of impoverished idea of education. It's not, the basic rationale for education period has always been that knowledge is power, that it's an empowering thing, but under the sort of extreme market ideology, come corporate supremacism, it's education is sort of reduced to a meal ticket. So you find you get the mocking of there's mocking of art students, business students in particular love to tell a joke about what the commerce student said to the art student. I'll have fries with that. That's a classic example of this. This tendency to view education as a meal ticket and a means to an end. It's sort of a very kind of fundamental dogmatic and fundamentalist view of what education is all about. So we find that the result of this shift has been the rise of the knowledge factory, inverted commas, and an instrumentalization of knowledge for the market rather than the public good. So as we noted, education is understood not to be good in and of itself, but only as a means to a paycheck. Here's a few graphic representations of the issues pertaining to the effect of neoliberal ideology on higher education. Up the top, we've got a machine labelled the education system. It's bringing in students who are sort of going through the machinery, pumping out graduates on a conveyor belt, with creativity, discipline, and intelligence sort of being spat out as apparent waste products, and the manager saying good. I don't know about you, but I don't know that we should be thinking of students as products. On the right-hand side, we've got a graphic element of education in the US. From 1988 to 2005, there was a 53% increase in full-time students, so the number of students increased by half, while professors declined by 22%, almost a quarter. So half as many students and quarter as many professors. So the quality of education is declining right there. Tuition fees increased 300%, while funding per student decreased 40%. I mean, those are horrific figures for the quality of education. But this is this is part and parcel of turning educational institutions into knowledge factories, running them like businesses for profit. and the implications for the kind of education you're going to get, and things like intercultural competence. And we were talking last week about integrating intercultural competence into all your studies. I mean, that's not going to happen under these kind of conditions. There's a book down the bottom left, Lawrence Bush, Knowledge for Sale, the neoliberal education takeover of higher education, might be one worth checking out. And in the middle, we've got an elephant representing the Republican Party saying, we're cutting your budget, your teachers, your books, and a student responds, class warfare. Well, it really is, isn't it? So in response to these issues, we find critical pedagogy being a critical approach to traditional education frameworks that have become subject to the same kind of corporate capture as national political institutions. So the same dynamics we're facing in higher education, we're finding in government in general, like captured by special interests and lack of responsiveness to the needs of the mass of the population, and they would appear to be connected. As we saw in Harper's reading last week, critical pedagogy emerged as part of the democratic shifts that took place in the 60s and 70s, which came about as a result of ongoing injustice at home in the West and the horrors of, US, but Western imperialism abroad, in which spurred Western populations into dissent and ideological nonconformity. So there was there was already some shifts going on in the sort of anti-democratic shifts that we're seeing in the present moment as sort of providing greater, a greater need for more of the same, really. So already critical pedagogy was critically unveiling the political and economic forces that threaten academic and school independence and creativity. And, already trying to draw our attention to the transformative potential of the academy and the school within wider society. This is opposed to, the traditional model we were looking at with Herber last week, of the authoritarian education, the sort of rote learning for, being programmed, again, for the same kind of mentality that, neoliberalism talks about now, which is to, sort of prepare people for work. In response to this kind of authoritarian approach, teacher-centered rote learning and socializing students for work, critical pedagogy emphasizes student-centered approaches. It applies what we call a constructivist methodology, which forms around student-centered approaches, which prioritizes learning not what to think, but how to think, how to think for ourselves. As a primary means of encouraging the capacity for independent thought, critical pedagogy emphasizes education through experience. This is obviously the origin of the experiential learning models that we've been looking at, associated with intercultural communication, and sort of provides its primary justification because in becoming a interculturally competent, we're also learning how to think for ourselves. A little bit more on the constructivist methodology, the experiential learning associated with critical pedagogy, where traditional forms of rote learning treat students like empty vessels who need to be filled with knowledge. In the metaphorical sense, like filling a jug with water. Critical pedagogy encourages a more nurturing approach, like nurturing a garden by watering it every day. Promoting an integral education based on encouragement of independent thought, critical pedagogy prioritizes self-actualization and personal growth over ideological programming or indoctrination and ideological orthodoxies, even in hegemonic orthodoxies, if you like. Benefits of this more open approach can be seen in the raising of awareness about interethnic conflict in the United States. Harper thought a bit of a boo-boo in his reading last week. He was talking about the social changes in the 60s and 70s as a reflection of increasing ethnic strife. Well, as we talked about in the tute at Mount Helen, this interethnic strife has always been a feature of American society from the earliest days of European settlement. They were battling the Native Americans who were there already. as they moved westward, there were the frontier wars, just as there were frontier wars here. And then bring in other issues like slavery, and like the deep vein of racism that's always existed in the US as it has here. Because they needed to justify the inhuman treatment associated with settler colonialism and slavery, which if you treat people like humans, then how do you rationalize that kind of thing? As we saw in the first couple of weeks, we need to be able to dehumanize the other in order to adopt the double standards that make things like colonialism and class possible. So we find that what we talked about in the Tune at Mount Ellen was that Harvard missed a crucial point in that the rise of these new modes of education, of critical pedagogy, actually made it possible to talk about this interethnic conflict, the deep veins of racism in American society. So it wasn't that it was there was more conflict. It was just there was more awareness of it because people were talking about it. So this arguably reflects the purposes of critical pedagogy and its critical value to the development of intercultural competence, because it actually provides spaces for, especially for the people who are the victims of this kind of violence and racially based oppression, to be able to express themselves and be heard, and to learn how to to sort of understand what's going on and speak for themselves. So, we find here's just a great piece of graffiti, the writings on the wall: education's a process, not a commodity. I think that in some ways that sums up the broad thrust of critical pedagogy beautifully, and especially in this day and age of neoliberalism and Naomi Klein's corporate supremacism. There was a couple of readings from Henry Giroux last week. This is taken from one of the recommended readings. I would again recommend that you check it out if you get a chance. Giroux wrote, "Citizens for a global democracy need to be aware of the interrelated nature of all aspects of physical, spiritual, and cultural life. This means having a deep-rooted understanding of the relational nature of global dependencies, whether we're talking about the ecosphere or the circuits of capital. Second, citizens need to be multi-literate in ways that not only allow them to access to new information and media-based technologies, but also enable them to be brought across as capable of engaging, learning from, understanding, and being tolerant of and responsible to matters of difference and otherness. This suggests reclaiming essential to any viable notion of citizenship the values of mutual worth, dignity, and ethical responsibility. At stake here is the recognition that there is a certain civic virtue and ethical value in extending our exposure to difference and otherness." That's a key sentence right there. Citizens need to cultivate loyalties that extend beyond the nation state, beyond the theoretical distinction in which the division between friend and enemy is mediated exclusively around national boundaries. I would argue that we even need to go further. We need to cultivate loyalties that extend beyond the known altogether, because as I've tried to stress throughout the semester, it's the known and the unknown extends far beyond national boundaries. Between genders, which we'll look at shortly, between ethnicities within a single country, within classes, within people from different areas. Look at the regional differences between Victoria and Queensland, or Victoria and South Australia. They are considerable. The people from different walks of life generally. There are a myriad of ways to get lost in the cultural difference, and the whole point of this. I think that the assessment task 4 in general has been to consider the myriad of ways that these kind of these dynamics manifest. And I think looking at the DMIS stages in particular, it's sort of brought out that the incredible level of difference and the miscommunication that takes place within our own sort of immediate environment. But in any event, I think the great value of this quote is that points out that that we need to sort of overcome, start looking at the the way things operate globally, and that means transcending the traditional forms of education which have been closely tied to building the nation state, which in this era of globalization, I mean, we've got the globalization for for business, but we're still teaching the nation state and national loyalties to in the political sphere. I mean, if that isn't a perfect example of cognitive dissonance, I don't know what is. And I mean, I think the fact that we are sort of so globalized economically and in terms of our communication tools means that our education needs to reflect that as well. All the more to the extent that the movement of people sort of brings people from other backgrounds closer to us, and communication tools brings us closer to others in other parts of the world. So yeah. I think the pivotal sentence here is that the civic virtue and ethical value in extending our exposure to difference and otherness, and that should be a particular feature of new modes of education as expressed in critical pedagogy. There's a great citation down the bottom where this quote comes from, so do check that out if you get a chance. So just to sum up, the links between DMIS, experiential learning, critical pedagogy. Now, we're looking at the three separate layers of theory and practice to promote intercultural competence and communication. I thought of it as a three-stack pancake. Presented here as a three-stack pancake of social harmony. DMIS on top, experiential learning in the middle, and critical pedagogy on the bottom, with the dollop of cream of intercultural competency on top is the sweetest bit. And Homer Simpson over on the right, social harmony. So yeah, they're all they're all interrelated features of development of intercultural competence and communication. Few resources on critical pedagogy. Do check those out if you get a chance. Again, I mean, the more reading you can do, the better. Got your readings for the week. If you grab some of these and look at them in your leisure, then so much the better. Let's move on a little bit. Well, just look at another one of these intercultural communication theories. This one is communication accommodation theory. Communication accommodation theory examines the adjustments we make while communicating through verbal or non-verbal forms of communication. Communication accommodation theory argues that we adjust our communication style while interacting with others. So under this theory, we do this either to set a positive image in front of others and win their approval through attuning to their modes and styles of communication, or we adjust to emphasize the social difference between ourselves and others by adopting an alternate mode or style, which we do in the name of asserting dominance. Communication accommodation theory also examines the extent to which people perceive their partner as appropriately attuning to them. So it's there's a bit of going outwards and sort of monitoring facet as well. The environment in which we are interacting is also understood to affect the communication behavior. So the context, especially if you're at work or in some kind of situation where you need to sort of, I don't know, where you're sort of, kind of working on, promoting yourself, I guess. Communication accommodation theory explains the two types of communication process that we're talking about here, by which we attune to the communication modes of others or assert our own as convergence and dominance and divergence. Convergence is a process where people tend to adapt to the other's communication characteristics to reduce social differences, or in the case of divergence, we contradict the method of adaptation in this context, emphasize the social difference and nonverbal differences, between us and whoever we're talking to. So, in order to, assert, usually to assert dominance. Communication combination theory is guided by, let's go back here a little bit. Let's look at convergence a little bit more. I mean, convergence is, I think the most common example of, where we do this is at work. So, I mean, if you're talking to, your employer, you immediately kind of adapt to their, communication style to sort of, make them feel like you're listening, to to sort of defer to, to their, expertise if necessary. And whereas, divergence can sort of be from the opposite end, like, especially in, I think, in, probably in hierarchical situations, if you're working at a big company or something like that, one of the, the big cheeses may well kind of adopt a divergent communication style to emphasize the fact that they're in charge. This this brings us back to sort of we're looking at in terms of verbal and non-verbal communication styles. The way that the way we can sort of use them to assert dominance and power, and also what we're looking at in terms of using communication to assert identity. If you're like a particularly middle management, where there might be a bit more insecure about their power, they'll use communication to really force their authority down your throat. We probably see that more, according to communication accommodation theory, that would be more of a divergent accommodation process. So we'd kind of do less accommodating and probably force the other person we're communicating with to effect more convergence in order to make sure that the tuning happened. Communication accommodation theory is guided by four major assumptions, in these processes that of a similarity and difference in speech and behavior. Characteristics of communication are based on experiences and cultural backgrounds. So we'll try to because accommodating, we're sort of trying to identify similarity and minimize difference, which we draw on experience and cultural backgrounds to affect this. Conversation is evaluated by perception of the other's speech and behavior. Through evaluation, people decide to accommodate and fit in. So I have to, there's the process of evaluation that takes place, and we sort of draw on experience and cultural backgrounds to decide whether we're going to, converge or diverge. Social status and belonging is determined by language and behaviours. People tend to accommodate the behaviours of those perceived to be higher social status than them. So, I mean, there's a kind of power dynamic behind this accommodation process. Norms varying, sometimes markedly inappropriate to guide accommodation processes. Norms define behaviour and and people are expected to act accordingly. So, there's sort of, this kind of complicates things a bit. To what extent do we tolerate, kind of questionable behaviours in the name of fitting in? And sort of accommodating the, those of a higher social status. There's a bit of a conflict between, doing what's right versus doing what, will kind of grease the wheels of our own advancement. So, have a bit of a think about whether you can think of any of these examples in daily life. Where do you see people trying to accommodate themselves to others in order to, increase increased communication, and especially in the intercultural contexts. I mean, between at work, there's an obvious class component between the sort of employee and management. You're sort of fitting into, oh yes, I believe that um, uh, you know work hard. I mean, there's no one at work who doesn't believe in working hard. I mean. Even if we haven't had a reduction of the working day in 150 years, I mean, you won't get one person at work who says no. Who tells the boss, especially when they're trying to get a job, I absolutely believe in working hard. That's a classic example of accommodating to someone of a perceived higher social status. I mean, especially with more power. But again, I mean, if you recall the graphic that we looked at last week, the job interview, with a sort of saying, what's your greatest weakness? I'm too honest, and then another someone else on the panel says, I don't think honesty is a weakness. Then the interviewer says, I don't give a stuff what you think. I mean, that's an example of I mean, while funny, it's sort of I mean, it's funny because it's sort of probably kind of a sharp violation of our sort of a tendency to accommodate others, especially in situations where we kind of sort of there's the means a purpose behind communication, especially in the situation of a job interview. But I'm sure you can think of others without too many problems. So features of communication and accommodation theory in general, it's done to fit in a group or to pay tribute to social status. Generally done to demonstrate agreement, belonging, and affinity. So you say you accommodate others in order to fit in. It can be conscious or unconscious, so you can do it on purpose or just do it sort of automatically. Accommodation can be both verbal and non-verbal. Accommodation includes psychological, social, and linguistic aspects of behaviour. Successful accommodation can err into under-accommodation and over-accommodation, so you can not do it very well or do it too well, and probably by that stage sort of becoming like a sycophant. Or a lickspittle, or what's the Smithers character from The Simpsons. Accommodation can be either beneficial or unfavourable. I mean, it's sort of depending on what you're accommodating to. If you're trying to accommodate yourself into, sort of a toxic environment, it's probably not a very clever move, especially if you're successful. Trying to accommodate yourself into like a bikie club or something, or the Ku Klux Klan. Interpersonal, intrapersonal, and intergroup dynamics can contribute to how effective or successful accommodation is or not. So, I mean, effectiveness of communication, like your likelihood of, getting on with other people, like how much you have in common, maybe. Intergroup dynamics, I mean, whether, the group's sort of inclined to, favorably inclined towards outsiders, all these sorts of various factors can fit in. Potential problems with communication accommodation can come off with being fake, pretentious, or sycophantic, as noted. Can be taken as mockery or intimidation. You're sort of come on too strong, or people take the divergent thing too far and becomes the power play becomes very overt. Can create a barrier to communication if used to patronise or condescend. Again, it's can be I don't know. I don't think the power play is a great idea at the best of times, but if it becomes too overt, it'll just become like overtly destructive. On the other hand, potential benefits of communication accommodation can make the listener appear interested, or if you actually are interested, you can better communicate that. Can make people feel like they're being listened to, make people feel like they're being understood, can make people comfortable, increasing the overall effectiveness of communication. So let's leave communication accommodation theory there for the moment. Hopefully, got a basic kind of grasp of what we're what's going on. We're trying to when we kind of talk, communicate with each other, where we try to sort of accommodate the person we're talking to, by evaluating the communication style. Keep probably a good one, in terms of intercultural competency in communication, and probably a good thing to keep in mind when, as sort of members of like a English speaking in group, and especially in like a sort of part of a dominant culture in a Western country like Australia, keeping in mind when, dealing with people from other backgrounds, maybe the sort of immediate impulse is to, adopt a kind of divergent accommodation approach in order to sort of maximize your kind of social privilege within, the bounds of Australia. But, from a sort of broader perspective, it's sort of, might be miserable and petty. But, just something to think about again. I've included the link just to the Wikipedia page. So, I mean, just have a bit of a glance over, the sort of general concepts, and keep it in mind as sort of one facet of the many and varied dynamics that influence the way we communicate with each other, and some of the things that can be sort of present as obstacles. So let's move on from metacognition and look a bit more at the cultural studies side of things now. We've already looked at the relationship between cultural identity and hegemony a little bit. As we've seen throughout the semester, there are many ways of approaching intercultural communication. DMIS tends to focus specifically on social relations between ethnicities, but this is by no means the only way that intercultural tension and conflict can occur. I mean, I think we've tried to stress this a fair bit. So, I mean, racism is a major problem in Australian society, but so too is sexism and misogyny. Find that general oblivious to both and an attitude of militant ignorance of being educated about either appears to be rooted in toxic masculinity and what we could probably describe as hegemonic patriarchal social relations inherited from our colonial forebears. I mean, I don't think it's. I mean, the Europeans who founded Australia were, didn't believe in gender equality. They came out of, the Europe, which was had just emerged from the European witch hunts. I mean, if you look at a book like Federici's Caliban and the Witch, which is a really phenomenal read. I mean, that looks at some of the major social dynamics taking place since the 16th century, which, by what is arguably not a coincidence, it was also the time that around which feudalism was ending, and the social processes that led to the Industrial Revolution were taking place. And as Federici argues, was the European witch hunts, which were used as a form of social engineering. It was a form of class warfare, waged by the Catholic Church, who, by the way, were the biggest landowner in Europe, sort of in concert with other, the remnants of the feudal aristocracy and the landed gentry and yeomans and sort of other sort of sectors of privilege and power in order to reimpose class relations. And the way they did that was by targeting the rebellious peasants through the witch hunts, and eventually by gendering them as well as a form arguably of divide and conquer. And this is the kind of thing that Federici goes into in some detail in Caliban and the Witch. Caliban is a reference to the Shakespearean character in what was the play? Brain fart. The Tempest. Caliban is the sort of working class, impoverished, outcast character who was sort of Federici sort of identifies with the kind of the witch character, the peasant women who were targeted for persecution. I mean, the interesting thing about the witch hunts in general is that the patriarchal hierarchy of the church targeted older peasant women because they were the repositories of folk knowledge, and as such were had a tendency to assert themselves, and were just a general cultural challenge to the power of the church. So a long story short, they the witch hunts and the sort of the extreme misogynist narratives and attitudes that were behind that were actually sort of inherited in large part by the modern world, because they became normalized over the course of 3 centuries. I think the witch hunts were also sort of where we get other aspects of modern language. The faggot was the group of sticks that was put under the pie when they burnt witches at the stake. And I don't think anyone needs any commentary on the usage of words like faggot in the modern era. I think that's, and with a direct etymology which traces directly to the European witch hunts. So I think that sort of tells us something about the legacy of that part of European history in particular, and it's kind of sort of continuing stranglehold, if you will, over modern society. But this is sort of the question that we're pointing to in the relationship between cultural identity and ideological hegemony. Sort of who pauses to think about the etymology of a word like faggot? But when we think about it, we sort of it sort of raises a lot of issues, in terms of how we relate to difference, I think, and how we treat diversity in society, and with the with sort of particular ongoing relevance for things like gender. So what are the I've always already thought about what are some of the ways that the influence of hegemonic narratives sort of influences us in the present. What are some of the other ways that this issue manifests? Well, here's one that I propose for you to think about. Gendered violence in Australia. Australia's, if you've been paying any attention at all, you'll notice that Australia's experienced an epidemic of fatal violence against women over the last while. And 2018, the toll for women murdered through gendered violence was 63, up from 53 in 2017. These are people who are victimized and murdered by someone who says loves them, as we see from the text here. This comes from an article called "Counting Dead Women: The Project Keeping Toll of Australia's Hidden Epidemic." There's been a domestic violence epidemic in Australia for years, and it's the murder of Eurydice Dixon in was it the Royal Parade? What is it, Royal Park? Was one particularly high profile and heinous example. Jill Maher was another particularly horrific example, and it just it keeps going. So this in the context of what we're looking at in particular at the moment, I think this kind of begs the question as to whether gendered violence is a pathological form of communicative incompetence. I want to think about that one a little bit. So I put it to you that the epidemic of violence against women demonstrates an excellent reason to learn about the relationships between the communication, gender, and culture. If you look at the bottom of the the screen here, there's reference to Wood, Gendered Lives. Is looks like a really great seminal text in looking at the issues of communication, gender, and culture. Frankly, I have to admit I haven't read the whole thing, but I did have I had quite a solid look at it this week, and we'll attempt to impart what I found. Wood argues that examining the relationships between communication, gender, and culture serves three important goals. One, it enhances appreciation of complex ways in which cultural values and practices influence our views of masculinity and femininity in men and women. Two, studying gender communication and culture enhances insight into our own gender, both as it is now and how we made to decide to revise it. We become more aware of ways that cultural expectations of gender are communicated to us in our daily life. Third, studying communication, gender, and culture can strengthen our effectiveness as communicators. Learning about general differences in women's and men's communication enlarges our ability to appreciate the distinct validity of diverse communication styles. So a few very great reasons to look further into this issue. Above and beyond the the pressing issue to kind of look at intergender communication in light of the ongoing epidemic of violence against women. So we find that verbal and non-verbal communication, which we looked at in the last few weeks, reflect cultural understandings of sex and gender. Hegemonic ideology prescribes specific identities and roles based on gender. Individual men's and women's communication can therefore reflect or challenge cultural prescriptions for femininity and masculinity. So again, reflecting what we've already looked at in terms of the relationship between culture and identity, and the way that this can be communicated through language. So, looking at how this manifests in gendered verbal communication, need to think about such questions as: do women or men generally talk more? How do childhood games affect adult communication styles? And what is conversational maintenance work, and who generally does it? Who is, if you're in a relationship, who is, usually taking on the work of, keeping things on an even keel, even in any kind of relationship. Wood argues that masculine speech communities tend to regard talk as a way to accomplish concrete goals, exert control, preserve independence, entertain, and enhance status. Conversation is often seen as an arena for proving oneself and negotiating prestige. So, about power, which in a patriarchal culture maybe isn't such a great surprise. So an example of gendered verbal communication. I now pronounce you man and wife. The guy putting two lobsters into a pot, presumably to be heated up while not noticing. What's wrong here? Is it something to do with the fact that we're only talking about a woman in relation to a man? The woman only exists as wife. Only in relation to a man. So that's this is a primary form of gendered verbal communication. Maybe the newlyweds are lobsters being lumped into a pot because the communication sucks. Maybe if they talked about conceived of themselves as man and woman or husband and wife, that there might be a bit more equality. But it seems like the first question to ask here is, well, is there are they sort of bound for trouble because they're lacking gender equality in the communication? Some of the other examples that Wood cites are Bob babysat his son while his wife attended a meeting. Well, what's wrong here? Arguably that Bob is sort of doing something out of the ordinary while his wife is kind of expected, just sort of understood to be, responsible for caring duties as a matter of course. Leave it to the French girl to make a Wimbledon fashion statement. Tatiana Golovin had the hottest pants. Well, I think we get the same thing in Parliament every time there's a woman parliamentarian. We're always focusing on the fashion sense, like not on what they're actually doing in the job. And freshmen find it difficult to adjust to college life, so a bit of gender-specific language that makes women invisible. I don't know. I mean, it seems like some of these are. We don't talk about the actors and actresses so much. We usually just seem to talk about actors these days. But I think there are, probably other examples that more of an issue. Reflecting on, so we've just looked at gendered verbal communication styles. How about gendered non-verbal communication? In reflecting on this, let's think about a couple of questions. One, how do women and men differ in the typical use of nonverbal communication to regulate interaction? Is physiology the cause of men's typically lower vocal pitch? How do women and men differ in their ability to interpret others' emotions? Well, just reflect on those, I think. Judith Butler claims that gender comes into being in our daily performances. In other words, she argues that communication, particularly our nonverbal communication, continually reproduces or challenges images of femininity and masculinity in male and female. We've already looked at a few of those just in talking about nonverbal communication in general. We'll look at another example in a minute. Wood argues that functions of gendered nonverbal communication involve supplementing verbal communication. So if you're saying go right, then you point right. Repeating words, contradicting a verbal message. So like so you repeat words, say yes, and then give the thumbs up. Contradicting a verbal message, so you say you're all right while you're weeping. Underlining a verbal message, so if you're saying go away, then you look angry. To replace verbal behaviors. If you're confused, then you don't say anything, but you just shrug. To accent verbal messages by, with accompanying gestures. Gendered nonverbal communication can be used to regulate interaction. We can use body posture, eye contact, and vocal inflection to signal others that we don't wish to speak, that we are through, especially in, in this context between women and men. To establish the relationship level of meaning expresses relationships between communicators. These are, in this context, these are things that, we guys should be looking for in order to, enhance our capacity for communication. I know what that Judith Butler quoting it there twice. Gendered nonverbal communication. On Creep Street. We looked at this in the week on nonverbal communication in general. I just picked up that photo and threw it in again. I mean, what a great example of the problems that can appear in this respect. Yeah, I mean, there's obviously, we were talking earlier about the, power dynamics. And this is a perfect example of communication forms being used to assert dominance. I think Biden's companion here is hugely excited. She looks like she's quite unexcited, actually. But again, it's old mate here is using this, the touch, the getting very close in order to assert power. Is he communicating in an effective, productive, constructive manner? Not so much. We're thinking about establishing the relationship level of meaning as a function of gendered nonverbal communication. This can encompass responsiveness, showing attentiveness to others and interest in what they say and do. Nonverbal cues of responsiveness include inflection, where you talk, eye contact and attentive body posture that expresses interest and involvement. Lack of responsiveness may be signaled by yawns or averted eyes. So if you're at a bar chatting to a lady about your Transformers collection, um, and you're scoring yawns and averted eyes, that's a cue that you're stretching the interest very thin. Liking. Non-verbal cues of liking include vocal warmth, standing close to others, touching and holding eye contact. We also use non-verbal behaviours to signal that we do not like others. Frown or glare communicates dislike, as does turning your back on someone or moving away from the person who sits next to you. So if you've started the the Transformers conversation and you're not getting anywhere, and she walks away from you, I think you know that you've that's a bust. So move on and talk about something else. Establishing the relationship level of meaning, power or control. Control issues in conversations include who defines topics, who directs conversation, who interrupts, and who defers. Though many non-verbal behaviours can convey control messages, three is especially important: vocal qualities, touch, and use of space. We've already looked at a few of these. In non-verbal communication, this brings in a clear gender component. Compared with women, men tend to use greater volume and stronger inflection to highlight their ideas and add to the force of their positions. Men also tend to use touch and domination of space to assert and reinforce status, as we've already seen with that picture of old mate Biden. So in light of all this, where do you see these behaviours manifesting in daily life? What is the quality of intercultural communication between genders when they do? Just to think on these things, the non-verbal and the verbal forms of communication, how they affect relationship between genders. This is Gendered Lives, the book that these ideas come from, is a thick book. I mean, there is so much to be said on this topic. I mean, it struck me in sort of looking at this that there's sort of in the space of you devote a unit to this without any trouble at all. The best we can do with this right now is to give you a bit of a taster of the area. I mean, I think for women and the subject in particular, a lot of this won't be news, but maybe this is more for the guys. But in general, this is another example of the same kind of things that we're looking at with the DMIS. The same kind of dynamics manifesting in the in the sphere of ethnicity. You look at the intersectional theory. These these dynamics sort of manifest in a multiplicity of ways. Any time there's a hierarchy or power imbalance based on some form of privilege, whether it's gender privilege, ethnic or racial privilege, class privilege, like national privilege, or you live in an affluent Western country, and the more we see these anywhere, the more we can see them everywhere, and this is actually a useful thing for to draw on when applying, arguably when applying Pfeiffer and Jones's 5 questions is an experiential learning tool to to sort of challenge lower order intercultural competency thinking, that Bennett highlights in the DMIS. This is also, this is sort of what I thought was interesting in terms of, using cultural studies as a way to sort of get around sometimes the lack of, formal assessment tools, the intercultural what was it called? The IDI, the intercultural inventory. Ugh, name's just that's really terrible, isn't it? The names just escape me. But there's the informal assessment tools. We can, maybe we can do like the informal assessment tools using these tools from cultural studies, and in this case with a particular emphasis on gender. So hopefully this sort of helps to just sort of set the tone for further inquiry. To that end, here are some resources on gender and communication. There's a few from Wood. There's a great story on the UN website there, and White Ribbon. White Ribbon is a great one to look at. So do go and look at those, and do some further reading if you get the opportunity. Here are your readings for this week. Going to look at there's a bit more on education, something on teachers' communicative strategies. Studying abroad, this will lead us into the next two lectures, which are on culture shock when traveling abroad, and culture shock for immigrants coming into new countries. Getting into a bit more detail in with the third-year reading for cross-cultural medical education, and there's a bit more in the further reading and read ahead on culture shock. The assessment task for this week is the Moodle quiz 3.3, worth 5% of the total. That's online, so do jump on in that and get that done before Sunday night. And coming up in next week is your assessment task 4.4, your response to DMIS stage 4. This is a stage 4 acceptance. This is the first stage of the ethno-relative phase of the DMIS. So that should be interesting. I look forward to seeing your responses to that. I still have to get do your assessments for 4.3. I'll get those out to you ASAP. Thanks for hanging in there, and I'll look forward to communicating with you soon for 4.4, and have a great week otherwise.